at that point, had to have more than one person. And so when you're with a group of people, you've got company, haven't you? So that's where the name comes from. It's a group of people gathered together to do a common purpose. To form a company in New Zealand now, you only need one person. So the requirement to have more than, or two or more shareholders is gone. So basic structure of a company now is that you need to have a shareholder, and that's the person or the people that own the company. And you need to have one or more directors. And as Mrs. Russell said, that's called the board. Every company's got a board. So the board tell the company what to do, and the company goes out and does it. But a company has to comprise of legal persons. There are other structures that you could use to carry out your business. And we'll run through them really quickly. Far away.
Can the shareholder and the director be the same person?
They can, and in New Zealand they often are now. Didn't used to be, but they are now. So the main structures. Individuals, you're all legal persons. A legal person is a person or a thing that can do all the things that a natural person can do. So as natural persons, I assume you're all natural, you can buy and sell things. You can sign contracts. You can agree to do things. You can incur liabilities. And that is common in other legal persons. So the next common legal person is the company, and that's what we'll focus on. But there are a few others. Any ideas? What else is out there? There's, very quickly then, there are partnerships. There are limited partnerships. There are incorporated charitable trusts. There are incorporated societies. There are some things that are not.
What are limited partnerships?
Come to that real quickly in a minute. Some things that are not legal persons are family trusts. And some of you may have parents who have family trusts, the house is in the trust or the business is in the trust. Those entities work through their trustees, which is probably going a bit off course today, but it's relevant. So if we look real quickly then at partnerships, limited partnerships, charitable trusts and incorporated societies, so we can knock them out of the way. A partnership is a group of people who get together for a common purpose but don't want to be a company or aren't allowed to be a company. Now there aren't very many of these left, and we'll talk about why when we look at the company in a little more detail. But the only profession left in New Zealand that can really only operate as a partnership are lawyers. So lawyers, up until about 10 years ago, weren't allowed to operate for a company, mainly because we're so untrustworthy that we have to be personally liable for our actions. We can now operate as companies in limited circumstances, but it's not worthwhile. Doctors are the other ones that often operated as partnerships. And it's just a group of people working together, sharing the risk, sharing the reward. A limited partnership is slightly different to that. A limited partnership allows a group of investors who don't really want to have anything to do with the business, put money into the business to pay somebody else to run the business, and they can take the profit out of it. Not very common, but at the moment I'm working on probably 4 of them. They're really good in particular circumstances. Probably not that relevant for you guys, but they're out there, and as your businesses progress, it's an option. The other couple then are incorporated charitable trusts. We'll talk a little bit more about them later on because they're quite interesting depending on where you want to go with your business. And incorporated societies. Incorporated societies, they run your tennis club, cricket club, the rugby club, soccer club. So they're generally a group of people getting together to do something in common that's not for profit, but something that they all get a kick out of doing. So if any of you belong to the Castaway Tennis Club, that's an incorporated society. If you play rugby at Takapuna, that's an incorporated society. Any of you rowers? Yeah. Rowing at Westlake is run by an incorporated society. I know, I forgot about the rules a few years ago. So let's look at the two main ones out of those things. The main one's a company, and the other one that's interesting to compare it to is a charitable trust. So a company, we've talked about earlier, has got a couple of key features, and those are, it's got a shareholder and it's got a director. It can be the same person, it can be lots of people. Any of you got shares through something like Sharesies or Hatch? Excellent. So those companies are all what are called public companies. And they're public because they're listed on an exchange. They're almost exactly the same as other companies, apart from the set of rules that govern how the shares in them can be traded. So a public company will have hundreds, if not thousands, of shareholders. Private companies might have one, might have two, might have 10, but the shares aren't publicly traded. So when you're looking at the structure for your business, why would you use a company? Why do people leave straight to companies?
You can expand quicker.
Can, but if you can get money in as an individual, you can grow the business too. But if you get money in as an individual, where's that money going to come from? Finance. Finance is a really good thing and a really bad thing. And finance is one of the big reasons why companies are companies. What's the one thing that every company in its name has in common? Every New Zealand company has got something in its name. Limited. What does limited mean? No, that's right. Don't know's a good answer. I like that. Limited means that its liability is limited. And so this is the big reason why most businesses, not all businesses, but most businesses are run through companies. So because I've got a whiteboard, I better use it. I can't write very well, I can't draw. But there is an individual. That individual, if he's going to get money, borrow money from a finance company, a bank, they lend the money, but you have to pay it back. So you're going to work as an individual, pay the money back. And the amount of money you pay back is always more than you borrow. You've got to pay for the right to use that money. And that's interest. You guys have done interest before. If the individual can't find the money to pay the bank back, the bank sues the individual. And if the bank wins, your individual becomes bankrupt. And if you're bankrupt, it means that you can't own or manage a business. You can't be a director in a company. The state owns your assets, what few are left, for at least 3 years, and it's a pretty miserable way to exist. So as budding businessmen, it's not a great idea. It gives you lots of freedom, and lots of freedom. Frees you up from all sorts of nasty accounting standards that Mrs. Russell can run you through. We've had some fun with them here at school because they keep changing. And as a commercial lawyer, accounting standards are not your friends. But we leave that to the accountants. It's not me. So our chap over here decides he doesn't like this liability stuff. So he finds a friend, and together they form a company. So your company ABC Limited. And that limited bit's really important. Limited is common to companies in New Zealand, Australia, most of the states in the United States, the UK, Canada, South Africa has a version, most of the European countries have versions, and a lot of the Asian companies have copied the English and American systems and have similar rules. But limited is common to all of them. Limited means that if our company borrows the money from the bank and it runs into trouble, and can't pay it back, then the bank sues the company. It doesn't sue the people. There's an exception to that, but don't worry about it. It will sue the company. The company can't pay it back. What happens to the company? The company gets liquidated for the job. But our shareholders walk away to live another day. So they can then set up another company. So the idea with limited liability is that it's a protection for the shareholders, for the people who have put money, equity, into that company. So it keeps them safe.
How will that affect the shareholders' ability to borrow money in the future?
It could do. It could do simply based on reputation.
Yeah.
But you're down here. You've still got your idea, possibly. Or you've got another idea. There are other choices of bank. And you go around the tracks. I've done work for people who have been bankrupted, liquidated, time after time. And they still get money lent to them because their ideas are great. But one guy in particular that we did a deal for last year. It was the fifth or the sixth startup business that I've worked with this guy. First one was in the late 90s. And every one that he had built up had either failed or needed so much more capital invested in it that he could squeeze out. But last year we did a deal with him, or for him, and he's now got 15 million and is living in California. But it took a long time, but we got there. So it's one of those good things. Not every time will it. So down here, you've got your company, and off they go again. And they just roll that out. So limited liability means that the company's assets are available to creditors. So creditors are people that the company owes money to, but the assets of the shareholders are not.
So what's the con of having a limited liability company? Because you've said that there's a bunch of benefits, but I assume that there's also going to be some negatives.
There are some negatives. Compliance, regulation. You need to run companies properly. One of the big things that companies have to do is report their finances properly. Now, they don't have to publicly report them, but there are requirements under the Companies Act and under the Financial Reporting Act, and then depending on what you're doing, possibly under the Financial Markets Conduct Act, that tell you how you have to operate. So, yes, companies are a good idea for that limited liability, but it comes at a cost. And that cost of doing business is something that things like limited partnerships don't necessarily incur, partnerships don't necessarily incur, individuals don't necessarily incur. You know, my law firm, for instance, we do accounts every year, but we don't do them in a format that would satisfy the company reporting requirements. We do them in a way that suits us, because we can, and that works better for us. But a company doesn't get that luxury, so they have to comply with the rules. There are also annual reporting requirements in terms of keeping public registers up to date with details of directors and shareholders. With a company, everyone can see who the directors are, everyone can see who the shareholders are, everyone can see what their residential addresses are, You can go on to public register and see what security it's given to people. So when you borrow money from a bank, for instance, you will often, as a company, give a security agreement. And that security agreement is registered, and it's registered publicly. And so people can see that you owe BNZ money. Well, they can't see how much, but they can see that you do. So there's good things and bad things. Another good thing with companies are that at the company level, they're taxed at a lower rate than individuals are. You catch up on the tax when you pay it out to the shareholders, but it just means they've got slightly more money to deal with. And that was one of the other reasons why companies came about, is that they are attractive to investors. And to get money into business, ideally, the market has to be attractive. Now, the market in New Zealand, in particular in the late 1890s, early 1900s, was pretty unattractive. And so the rules changed so that shareholders' investments into their businesses, into their companies, was protected. So 1890s, 1900s, 400 or 500 companies in New Zealand. 120 years later, there are now thousands and thousands of them, because they've become much more attractive for people to put money into. So if your money goes in, it's safe unless you can't pay these guys back, or unless the business deal goes bad and you lose in court. But the shareholders' liability to the bank only goes so far as the amount of money that they've put into the company. So if you set up a company, put $100 in, you've got 100 shares at $1 each, and you've actually paid that dollar, that's all you as a shareholder will ever be liable for. So you might lose your investment, or the value of your investment might drop. But these guys are never going to come to you and say, well, you owe us more because the company can't pay us. So that's the real benefit, that limited liability. And that's why they won't let lawyers have it, because you can't trust a lawyer. The exception I mentioned before, that there is an exception to this protection for shareholders, is that banks will often take security. And security is something that the bank can hang on to while you've got the bank's money. The most common thing you hear about as security are mortgages. So if you're reading the news and reading about house prices and about how they're really expensive and the banks are lending a bit less at the moment because the rules have tightened up, when the bank lends money to buy a house, they take security. And that security is called a mortgage, and the mortgage attaches to the land. So if the borrower can't pay the money back, the bank can sell the house under the mortgage. The banks have similar arrangements for companies. They used to be called debentures, they're now called general security agreements or general security deeds. And that attaches to all the company's assets, but they'll also often have personal guarantees from the shareholders. And particularly as you guys get started, and you haven't really got anything to offer the bank as security. You've got a great idea, but great ideas don't necessarily have the value attached to them early on. You'll find that there's a personal guarantee that follows it. And so your earlier question about can you get money here depends whether you've been nailed under a personal guarantee. As your company becomes more successful and it has more assets and bigger business, you can argue with the banks about having the guarantees dropped. And so that's a big part of what I do. The saying to these guys, look, you've got enough security now. Let the company do its own business. And off they go.
What happens to the assets that can't be liquidated, like maybe employees need to be paid off?
They lose out. So it's a big bad world out there. In the Bank of the Companies Act is a list of the order in which creditors, people the company owes money to, get paid on a liquidation. Employees are right at the top of that list, but only to a certain level. and it's top of my head, it's about $20,000 per employee, might be a bit less than that. But that's after the tax man's been paid, after the bank's been paid. So it's, liquidation can be very tough on employees. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time it won't, because the assets are gone trying to pay the bank back. Limited partnership, just on this side of things, means that if, again, an investor can put their money in, just like a shareholder can in a company, and that's the extent of the investor's liability. The limited partnership might be liable, but the investors won't be. So it's another option for structure. How we go? The comparison I was going to make was between a company and a charitable trust. So a company, limited liability, the investors put their money in, and often in small companies, those investors are the shareholders, are the directors, are the people who do all the work. And so what they're looking for is profit. And those shareholders can take the money out of the company when it becomes profitable in the form of dividends, mainly, but also through director fees, management fees, all sorts of ways to get your money out. Depending on what you want to do, charitable trust is another option. So it depends on what your purpose is. If your goal is to make all the money you can make and keep it, so you can go and buy a fancy foreign car and have holidays in Europe, then the company's what you want. But if your aim is to help people, a company might not be the right way to go. Charitable trusts don't pay income tax, which is, in a company at the moment, 28% of your profit goes in tax. Charitable trust doesn't have to do that, it keeps the money. But the difference is that the money it makes has to be used for charitable purposes. Now, there's a lot of company law, business law, that goes back to about a 10-year period between 1600 and 1610. And during that period there was an act called the Statute of Elizabeth, which now forms the basis of New Zealand's Charitable Trust Act. And that says that if you are carrying out activity for the good of the people in education, religion, health, or relief of the poor, you don't have to pay income tax. But you can't take money out of what you're doing for yourself. So if you've got a great idea to help deaf people, and one of the other hats I wear is I'm chair of a trust that does cochlear implants for deaf people. And if you think, well, this is something I want to do with my idea, my invention, then you set up a charitable trust, you don't pay any income tax, and you've got more money to do those good things. All of your parents, if they haven't been already, will be asked shortly to pay the donation to the school. Schools are charities. Nobody makes money out of the school. And so the money that the school collects as school donations isn't taxed. Your parents will get a tax credit on it, which is always nice. But the school itself doesn't have to pay tax on that income. So that's the charity side. So if you have a great idea, it's going to benefit people in health, education, recreation is the other one in New Zealand. We're a bit odd. You can generally give money to the tennis club, and the tennis club doesn't have to pay tax on it. You can still get paid for the work you do within a charitable trust, and you should be paid, but you just can't make a profit. So it's an option. Depends which way you want to go. That's probably about it for a real quick run over the target on legal persons, companies, limited liability, a few pros, a few cons, how they work, a couple of the other possible examples that you could do. On my desk at the moment, with the work I'm doing work with companies, individuals, charitable trusts, limited partnerships, incorporated societies, and a couple of family trusts. So all of those are involved in businesses. They're all slightly different. But the main common one, the most common one, are companies. So that's probably it. Fire away.
You said that in a charitable trust you should still be paid, it's just you can't get profit of it.
Yep.
But what's stopping you, or what's stopping you from just increasing the amount that you get paid?
Because you, as an incorporated charitable trust, a bit like companies, you're subject to regulations. And one of those regulations is that you have to file accounts every year. And the accounts for charities are publicly available. So for instance, the one I mentioned, my chair is called the Northern Cochlear Implant Trust. If you were to look on the Charitable Trust Register, you would find that trust there, you'd find our rules, but you'd also find a copy of our latest accounts. And those accounts are then looked at by the charities office, and if they think you're paying yourself too much, they'll be talking to you.
Is that where you can find the school's records?
No, schools records aren't there. Through the Ministry of Education you can always see them. Schools are different. That's a good question actually. There are a raft of other types of entities that are out there that aren't going to be much good to you in a business sense. And those are legal persons that are created by statute. So an Act of Parliament creates them. So schools are set up under the Training and Education Act now, but they are also Crown entities, so they're subject to various rules that the Crown has set up about Crown entities. Other examples of entities like that are district health boards, so the Waitemata District Health Board that looks after the hospital down the road here and the one out in Waitakere. And then you get into a number of special purpose entities that are set up by Parliament to do particular things. And it's generally around health, education, the environment, so they get special protection.
Would a private school be listed as like a company?
Depends how they've been set up. Some of them are set up under what are called private acts, not public acts, private acts. Eden Park is an entity that's set up under a private act. Some of them are set up as companies, so yes, you can look them up on the company's office and find out who the directors and shareholders are. Have you all seen the company's office registered? You know what that is? Yeah, it's a website. So there's, it's probably the website I use the most. But it's a public register online. If you Google Company's Office NZ, you'll come up with Company's Office website. You can put the name of a company into a search engine, and it will then tell you when that company was set up, who its directors are, who its shareholders are, where they live, what its rules are, and it's all there publicly. So it's worth having a squiz at. Companies, I think it's just companies.govt.nz, roughly. Any other queries, questions, comments? Have any of you got shares in a company that's not on Sharesies or Hatch? No, plenty of time. But that, as a corporate commercial lawyer, those are the entities that I deal with most commonly. And you set them up, you make sure that the shareholders are protected, the directors are protected as far as you can. Being a director comes with some risk. And then it's the company that does the business. It's the company that signs the contracts with its suppliers, with its customers, and ideally the money builds up in that company. And you get to a point where the company doesn't need all the money that it's got, so it can push some back out to the shareholders. So if you, through Sharesies or Hatch, have shares in JB Hi-Fi, Warren Park down here, JB Hi-Fi, it's listed in Australia. They are paying $457 million back to their shareholders in the next couple of weeks. Just because they've taken risks. The risks have worked, they've got more money than they know what to do with, so the shareholders get a share of that.
What's that called when they pay it back? The dividends.
It's dividends, yeah. And it can be paid in a number of different ways. It can be a dividend, it could be done as a share buyback, and part of, I think, the JB Hi-Fi one is the company buying its own shares back from its shareholders. But the effect is the same, you still get the money. And your proportional shareholding remains the same.
I go through something, I've been in something called like a fisherman fund.
Yep.
Since I was a child, so my grandparents put it in there.
Yep.
And I think the way it works is they put money in, and then fisherman fund, the company, invest it into
Yep.
other organisations, and we like split the profit. There
Yep.
isn't it?
Yep.
I was making sure that's the way it works, or how is that sort of company run?
So those are managed funds. They are run by a company, so Fisher Funds is one, Milford Asset Management's another, there's a group of them. And what the investors are basically doing is contracting with the company. And so you're saying to the company, here's my money, I'd like you to invest it for me. And the company says, great, I'll take 10 out of every $100 as my fee, thank you, and then I'll do the best that I can for you. And so they'll invest the money on your behalf in different places, and the value of your holding will go up and down depending on what the markets do, and you may get money back out to you at times as well. And then ideally, when you take your money out at the end of it, it's growing by a lot more than the amount of money you put in.
But you don't get any shares in the company?
Not in your own name. No, not in your own name. It's so your shares in shares in New Zealand or Fonterra or Vulcan or whoever will be held as Fisher Funds nominee number 27 limited. So your name won't be on the share register. Theirs will, yours won't. Same with Sharesies, same with Hatch. All those shares are held through what are called nominee companies, and they're companies that are set up to hold other people's assets and try and keep their identity secret. It's also a good way of controlling.
I know that there's I think it's basically an app or a website in the US called Robinhood.
Yep.
And it's basically a platform where you can easily buy and sell shares. But the way they get their money is by selling that data to other investors, and then they'll bid against you or whatever. And
Yep.
ultimately you'll mainly take a loss. And that's how they get their money.
Yeah, well, data is just simply an asset.
Yeah.
So data is big at the moment because there's a lot of it floating around and it's not very regulated yet. It's getting more so. But data is like having 100 cows or 10 trucks or 50 houses. It's just something else that you can buy and sell that has value to somebody else. The ways that you collect it can be a bit dodgy sometimes. We're doing some work at the moment in my firm on web scraping, which is a big problem at the moment, but that's just another way of collecting data. But ultimately, the people doing the scraping want to sell it. And so their company makes the income from that.
How would you figure out if a company like Sharesies does the same?
They undoubtedly do. And the way that you can tell that is by doing what nobody does, and that is reading the terms and conditions when you sign up. So you will have all signed up to websites. You got to a point where you can't go any further unless you tick the box that says, I agree to the terms and conditions. And my guess is that none of you will ever have read any of those terms and conditions. You have? Good. Well, you might have read something that I've written. Nobody else does. But that's how you do it. And those terms and conditions will say, we can collect your personal information and we can use it to do this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and you've agreed to it. So it's...
Yeah, because they're so long that nobody wants to read 46 pages either.
Exactly.
You have to write all 46 pages.
Yep.
I guarantee at least half of it is waffle.
Nope.
No, really?
Not,
You just
nothing that I've written's ever been waffle.
Okay.
But you do, I mean, some of the, some
reckon,
terms
I
and
reckon there'll be
conditions, sure.
some that are just, some of it is just, is to increase it so people go, okay, I don't want to read all this. Because I've read a couple of terms and conditions where I've read something and then I wreck it and then I go down the page and like, didn't they just say this in different writing?
Sometimes yes.
I've
Sometimes yes.
seen that.
And you do find some good clauses.
Mm.
I have found an end of the world clause of one.
Well, oh, yeah, I know a couple of those for games that have said you will be, if
Well,
you do this, you'll be banned till the end of time.
This was in a Swiss banking document. In the event of the end of the world, the forces of light will be aligned with the borrower, and the forces of darkness will be aligned with the bank. Great. All right, I'm done.
Just on behalf of all the boys here, I just want to thank you for giving us your time and share all those things about limited companies, partnerships. I'm sure we've all taken some of them today. So.
Great.